Several years ago, as I was flipping through the stations, I stopped at one of the television preachers. And I rarely watch or listen to any of the preachers on television. And now, since I am a preacher on television, I've got to be a little bit more careful, perhaps, what I say about them. But on this particular occasion, as I kind of came into the middle of that sermon, the preacher said something to the effect that if you have a cross in your life, you are living outside the will of God. And I thought, well, how can that be? Jesus had a great big cross in his life, and we believe he was fully in the will of God. And in this text, Jesus says to us, if you want to be a follower of mine, you must take up your cross and follow me. I attended Greenville College in Greenville, Illinois. It is a free Methodist church-related college. We were required to attend chapel 3 times a week, Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. We were allowed 2 absences per semester. If you missed more than 2 chapels per semester, you were called into the dean's office to find out why. On one particular occasion, Carlisle Marney, who was a fairly prominent theologian of the late last century, was the special speaker. And I don't remember anything else that he said except referring to this text, take up your cross and follow me. Carlisle Marney said that that word "and" is a holy conjunction. Not just a conjunction, but a holy conjunction. Take up your cross and follow me. Now, not too many of us want to hear about taking up our cross. And exactly what that means, particularly for us on a personal level, I may not be able to particularly say. But I can say some general things based on our Bible text from today. Let's look at Moses for a little while. You will remember that Moses grew up in the household of the Pharaoh's daughter, rescued from the Russians. He grew up in a place of privilege. He grew up in a place of honor. He grew up in a safe place, away from his relatives, the Hebrew people who were enslaved by the Egyptians. And yet when, as an adult, he saw the injustices perpetrated against his people, he left the privilege, he left the safety, he left the honor of the Pharaoh's daughter's home, and he forsook that way of life. He gave that up. He gave up the safety of all of that. He gave up the privilege of all of that. And so the question that is posed before us is, what are we willing to give up for the sake of the kingdom of God? Here is Moses. He's out there keeping a flock, and he's up on this mountain with the flocks, and all of a sudden he sees this burning bush. And he goes over to investigate it. In the process of investigating that, in the process of hearing God speak to him, God says to him, I want you to go and deliver my people from the Egyptians. And Moses says, I don't think I'm the right guy to do that. Moses didn't accept that task willingly. He resisted against it. A little bit later on, Moses even said, well, Lord, I'm not the guy to do this. I can't even talk well. I stutter when I talk, or I get tongue-tied when I talk. I'm not a real good public speaker. I'm not the person who can go and really talk convincingly for my people to be like, oh, you really need to find somebody else. And God said, no, Moses, you're the guy. So the question that encounter raises for us is, what excuses do we come up with? Moses didn't want to go. He couldn't talk well enough, he thought. But God said, "You're my man." So God may be saying to you today, "You're my man, you're my woman to do this particular task, to do this particular ministry. You're the one I want." And what excuses do you need to lay aside in order to do what God is calling you to do? In some ways, the fact that Moses was willing to give up the safety of the Pharaoh's house, the fact that Moses was willing to lay aside his excuse that he wasn't a good enough talker to be the leader, that was Moses taking up his cross, following the way of God. It may not have been Jesus he was following, but it certainly was the way of God in his life. Now, let's move along to the reading from Paul. Paul, that text is just full of instructions. But it begins with this: let love be genuine. Let love be sincere. Remember, this is the same chapter in which Paul started out that saying your lives should be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And now he gets into the practical application of what it means to be transformed in our lives. And he starts out by saying love should be genuine and sincere. Let love be genuine. We sang earlier today that hymn, The Gift of Love, that's based on the text from 1 Corinthians 13, the great love chapter of the Bible, in which it says, love is patient and love is kind, love does not seek its own way, it does not easily become jealous. The list goes on. Let love be sincere. It goes on to talk a little bit more about what it means to love somebody then there in Romans. Cling to what is good, hate what is evil, be devoted to one another in brotherly love, honor one another above yourselves. One day when I was sitting in college in my New Testament class, Frank Thompson, who was the professor, came into class. Now, this particular class met right after lunch. And so, and Dr. Thompson and some of the other professors used to go running during lunch time. And every now and then he would come in late because the run took a little bit longer than normal. Or sometimes he came into class and he hadn't had time to shower yet to get cleaned up from his run. But on this particular occasion, he came into class and he said, "You know, I was in my office earlier today, and one of the other professors came in all excited. And he looked at me and he said, 'Frank, I've been reading in Romans, and in Romans there, Paul says, outdo one another in showing honor.'" And the other professor looked at Dr. Thompson and said, "Can you imagine what it would be like around this place if we actually did that? If we actually tried to outdo one another in showing honor to others?" Paul says, honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal. Keep your spiritual fervor. Serve the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Now, you can take your pick of any of those instructions and say, boy, that's one that I need to work on. I need to work on that in my life. Maybe one of those brief instructions will be the cross that God is calling you to take up and to bear. Because Jesus said, take up your cross. Some people think that the natural sufferings that we go through in life is our cross. And that may be part of it. But Jesus said, your cross isn't something that just kind of comes along and it's laid on you. He's saying to be active. Take up your cross and follow me. Loving may be an area in our lives where we need to take up that cross and follow Jesus. Or perhaps the next instruction may be a little bit more difficult for us. Because Paul then jumps into, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. In other words, learn to forgive. Forgive others who have harmed you. Forgive others who continue to harm you. Do not seek revenge, but leave that up to God. And I would dare say that if you're like me, forgiving can be a challenge in our lives. And it is particularly difficult to forgive someone when the hurt has been so deep in our lives. Forgiving others is not easy, but that may be the cross that God is calling us to take up as we seek to follow Jesus in our lives. The other evening, I was flipping through channels and I came across the ending of the movie Saving Private Ryan. That is a graphically violent movie. It contains a lot of graphic language that aren't suitable for young ears or old ears, really. But I decided to watch, and it was about the last 30 or 40 minutes of it. The squad that had been sent to save this particular private, bring him home so that he could go home because his other 3 brothers had been killed already in the service and he was going to be honorably discharged. They were being faced with an attack by the Germans. At the end of the movie, the captain, I think it was, who led the squadron to go save Private Ryan, was fatally injured towards the end. And as Private Ryan went over to check on him, the captain leaned forward and said something into Private Ryan's ears. And then the captain dies. And then the movie focuses in on the face of Private Ryan, and as they focus in on the face of this young private, then the camera eventually fades into seeing the face of this older Private Ryan as an adult male, probably somewhere in his 60s, now standing at the cemetery where the white cross marks the burial plot of the captain who had saved his life. And he stands there, and you can tell all of the events surrounding the action of the squadron to save his life have been replayed through the movie. And you can tell by his facial expressions that he is filled with just a deep sense of gratitude for the actions of this particular man, particularly. And his wife comes up to talk with him for a few minutes, and he turns to her and says, tell me that I'm a good man. Tell me that I've led a good life. Because exactly what was whispered into his ear, I've never quite figured out, except by his response there. It seems to be that the captain encouraged him to lead a good life worthy of the people who gave their lives that he could be saved. And then the camera pans wide, and you see the rows and rows of white crosses in this cemetery marking all of the soldiers who gave their lives so that others could live.